June 6, 1944, 0147 hours, 800 feet above the Cotentin Peninsula, Normandy. Captain John Ray watched his instrument panel flicker as another burst of German flak illuminated the night sky. The C-47 Skytrain bucked violently. Behind him, 18 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division gripped their static lines, their faces ghost white in the red jump light. They were supposed to drop at Drop Zone A, 3 miles inland from Utah Beach. That was 12 minutes ago. Ray glanced at his compass. The needle spun uselessly. The formation had disintegrated somewhere over the channel when German anti-aircraft batteries opened up. Cloud cover obscured every landmark. His radio crackled with panicked voices from other transport pilots, all reporting the same thing: scattered, lost, flying blind through the most critical hours of the invasion. The jumpmaster, Lieutenant James Deal, appeared at Ray's shoulder. His eyes asked the question his voice couldn't over the engine roar. Ray looked down. Nothing but darkness. Fields, hedgerows, flooded lowlands. Could be anywhere in a 30-mile radius. The briefing had been explicit. Drop altitude 600 feet minimum. Speed 90 miles per hour. Deviation from drop zones would scatter the assault, leave infantry without support, compromise the entire western flank of Operation Overlord. Then Ray saw it. A church steeple. The distinctive crossroads. Not Drop Zone A, but he recognized it from the reconnaissance photos. Sainte-Mère-Église. A secondary objective, heavily defended. His altimeter read 400 feet and falling as he took evasive action from ground fire. What happened in the next 90 seconds would save the lives of those 18 men and inadvertently secure the first town liberated in Nazi-occupied France. For 3 years, Allied planners had wrestled with the mathematics of death that governed airborne operations. The concept was revolutionary. Deliver entire infantry units behind enemy lines before the main invasion force hit the beaches. But the execution had proven devastatingly difficult. The C-47 Skytrain, designated the Dakota by the British, was the workhorse of Allied airborne operations. Powered by twin 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines, it could carry 6,000 pounds of cargo or 28 fully equipped paratroopers. But carrying them and delivering them accurately were vastly different propositions. The aircraft cruised at 160 miles per hour, but for parachute operations, pilots had to slow to 90 miles per hour at precisely 600 feet altitude. At that speed and height, they became targets. Sicily had been a bloodbath. During Operation Husky in July 1943, scattered drops left paratroopers isolated across 60 miles of hostile territory. The 82nd Airborne Division's 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment recorded jump dispersal patterns averaging 8 miles from designated drop zones. Some men landed 35 miles off target. The 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment jumped into Allied naval. Formations and gunners shot down 23 C-47s before someone stopped the massacre. Total casualties: 410 aircraft crew and paratroopers killed by friendly fire and enemy action, with another 600 captured within hours of landing. Italy compounded the disaster. At Salerno in September 1943, German anti-aircraft fire destroyed 16 C-47s before they reached drop zones. Navigation errors scattered the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion across terrain ranging from mountains to coastline. Paratroopers spent 3 days trying to assemble into combat-effective units. Lieutenant General Louis Brereton, commander of the 9th Air Force responsible for D-Day troop carrier operations, wrote in his assessment after Sicily, "We have developed an extraordinarily effective method of delivering infantry directly to the enemy. We have not yet solved the problem of delivering them to the location where they can be most effective." The statistics backed up the pessimism. Airborne doctrine required 75% of troops landing within 1 mile of drop zones to achieve tactical cohesion. Sicily achieved 12%. Training exercises over England throughout 1943 and early 1944 rarely exceeded 40% accuracy, even without enemy fire. What made Normandy particularly terrifying was the geography. The Germans had flooded vast sections of lowland behind Utah Beach, creating swamps that would drown paratroopers weighted down with 80 pounds of equipment. They'd also fortified key crossroads and towns with machine gun positions, knowing Allied paratroopers would converge on recognizable landmarks. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had personally inspected coastal defenses and predicted that airborne assaults would be slaughtered if they could be fixed in place during their vulnerable first hours on the ground. The invasion plan called for 13,000 American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions to secure the western flank of the invasion beaches. They would jump in darkness, hours before the seaborne assault, and had to capture causeway exits, bridges, and defensive positions before German reinforcements could reach the beaches. If the drops scattered like Sicily, isolated groups of paratroopers would be hunted down and eliminated piecemeal. The entire western flank of Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, depended on transport pilots finding their drop zones in darkness while under fire. But by 0130 hours on June 6th, as the aerial armada crossed the channel, every carefully rehearsed plan began disintegrating. Thick cloud banks forced formations to break apart. German anti-aircraft batteries opened up earlier than expected, forcing violent evasive maneuvers. Radio navigation beacons either malfunctioned or were jammed. And Pathfinder teams that were supposed to mark drop zones with lights had themselves been scattered. More than 800 C-47s, carrying America's elite airborne divisions, were flying blind into one of the most heavily defended sectors of Nazi-occupied Europe. And most of the pilots had no idea where they were. German intelligence had anticipated the airborne assault. What they underestimated was the chaos it would create. General Major Wilhelm Falley, commander of the 91st Air Landing Division stationed in the Cottonton Peninsula, had studied Allied airborne doctrine extensively. His assessment, filed 3 weeks before D-Day, concluded that large-scale night drops would be operationally impractical given navigation limitations and defensive measures. His reasoning was sound. Transport aircraft needed clear weather, tight formations, and precise navigation to achieve concentrated drops. German anti-aircraft deployments and deliberate flooding of drop zones would, in his analysis, create such dispersal that Allied paratroopers would pose minimal threat for the critical first 6 hours. Rommel agreed. His defensive strategy relied on destroying the invasion at the waterline, but he welcomed airborne operations as a preliminary gift. Let the Allies scatter their elite units across the countryside in darkness, he reasoned, and German infantry could eliminate them in detail before they ever assembled into coherent fighting units. The German 352nd Infantry Division, positioned in the Normandy sector, had trained specifically for anti-airborne operations. Machine gun teams knew to target church steeples, crossroads, and bridges, anywhere paratroopers would gather. The plan was elegant in its brutality. Let gravity and geography do most of the killing. What neither Falley nor Rommel fully grasped was that scattered chaos could be a weapon. American airborne commanders had nightmares about Sicily. Major General Matthew Ridgway, commanding the 82nd Airborne, and Major General Maxwell Taylor of the 101st Airborne had watched their divisions scattered and chewed apart in the Mediterranean. They'd revised training, improved aircraft navigation equipment, and coordinated with troop carrier commands until they achieved acceptable, if not perfect, drop accuracies in exercises. Then came the night of June 5th, and every improvement evaporated under actual combat conditions. By 0145 hours, the Pathfinder teams, who were supposed to mark drop zones with radar beacons and colored lights, had achieved roughly 20% accuracy. Cloud banks broke formations apart. German flak forced evasive action that destroyed carefully calculated approach vectors. Radio navigation failed, and hundreds of C-47 pilots faced an impossible choice: orbit until conditions improved and risk running out of fuel or losing their paratroopers to dawn attacks, or drop their men wherever they happened to be and hope terrain didn't kill them before Germans did. Transport Command had been explicit: minimum drop altitude 600 feet, maximum 700 feet. Below that, parachutes might not fully deploy. Above that, men would drift off target and spend critical seconds floating vulnerably in the air. Speed restrictions were equally rigid: 90 miles per hour at drop, with red light warning at 100 yards from drop zone, green light to jump. But those parameters assumed pilots knew where drop zones actually were. Captain John Ray, along with several hundred other transport pilots scattered across the night sky over Normandy, didn't have that luxury. He had 18 men, whose lives depended on his decision, an altimeter dropping below minimums, and a church steeple he recognized from reconnaissance photos. Then, the aircraft shuddered from a near-miss flak burst, and his decision time ran out. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the D-Day airborne drops. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about the transport pilots who made impossible decisions over Normandy, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II aviation history, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Captain John Ray was not a rookie. He'd flown 31 combat missions, including supply drops to Patton's Third Army during training exercises, and the real thing during the Sicily invasion. He'd seen C-47s cartwheel into the Mediterranean when they dropped too low. He'd watched parachutes fail to deploy at insufficient altitude. He knew exactly what the manual said about minimum drop parameters. His altimeter read 380 feet. The anti-aircraft fire had forced him down, trading altitude for speed in evasive maneuvers. Now, he was below every safety margin, off target by at least 3 miles, and the green light schedule was already 14 minutes behind. Behind him, Lieutenant Deal stood at the open door, 18 paratroopers hooked to the static line cable, waiting for the signal. Ray made his calculation in less than 5 seconds. He could climb back to 600 feet, giving German gunners a slower, more predictable target, and search for the actual drop zone, potentially running out of fuel before finding it. Or he could drop these men right here, right now, at an altitude that violated every regulation in the troop carrier manual. The church steeple passed beneath his left wing. Sainte-Mère-Église. He recognized the crossroads, the town square. This wasn't the planned Drop Zone A, which lay 3 miles northeast. But reconnaissance photos showed this town sat astride a critical intersection. Paratroopers here could interdict German reinforcements trying to reach Utah Beach. Ray pushed the throttles forward, gaining 15 miles per hour to 105. The extra speed would help clear the anti-aircraft fire. It would also give paratroopers harder opening shock and less time to steer toward the town square. He hit the red light. Deal immediately turned to the stick of paratroopers. The red light meant 60 seconds. At this speed, that was roughly half a mile. Men shuffled toward the door, checking equipment one final time. Several had seen the tracers coming up from German positions. They knew this wasn't the rehearsed drop. Ray counted down. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Harold Sweetland, kept eyes on the instruments and the sky ahead. Another C-47 flashed past their right wing, 200 feet higher, also off course. Tracer fire arced up from the eastern edge of town. A machine gun team had spotted them. 30 seconds. The town square centered beneath the aircraft's belly. Ray could see individual buildings now, dark squares against darker fields. The crossroads formed a perfect X. German vehicles were parked along the northern road. This was occupied territory, enemy ground, and he was about to drop American soldiers directly into it at barely 300 feet altitude. 15 seconds. Ray's thumb hovered over the green light switch. He heard the distinctive crack of rifle fire over engine noise. The Germans in Sainte-Mère-Église had woken up to the invasion. Tracers intensified. Something hit the aircraft's fuselage aft of the cargo door with a metallic bang. Green light. DL slapped the first man's shoulder. Private John Steele, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, stepped into the slipstream and vanished. The next man followed 1 second later, then the next. The static line cable rattled as 18 parachutes deployed in rapid succession. Each man pulled into the 105-mile-per-hour wind stream. From Ray's perspective, the paratroopers seemed to pop their chutes almost immediately. The lower altitude meant less descent time, maybe 15 seconds from door to ground instead of the normal 30, but it also meant less drift. The stick of 18 men would land in a tighter pattern, closer together. What Ray couldn't see as he banked away from the town was the scene unfolding below. Private Steele's parachute deployed at 280 feet altitude. The opening shock was brutal, harder than training jumps, and he barely had time to pull his risers before buildings rushed up beneath him. He landed on the church roof, his parachute catching the steeple. For the next 2 hours, he would hang there, playing dead, as the battle for Sainte-Mère-Église raged below him. He would survive. His story would become one of D-Day's most famous individual accounts. The other 17 paratroopers landed within 200 yards of the town square. 3 landed in trees on the eastern edge, tangled but alive. 2 landed in a vegetable garden behind German-occupied buildings. 1, Sergeant Ray Ebisher, landed directly in the town square, rolled, and immediately engaged German soldiers who'd been sleeping in requisitioned houses minutes before. The low-altitude drop had done something unexpected. Instead of scattering across miles of countryside, Ray's stick of paratroopers had concentrated in and around the town itself. And they weren't alone. 2 other C-47s, equally lost and equally desperate, had dropped their sticks in the same vicinity within 3 minutes of Ray's drop. Suddenly, 52 American paratroopers were inside or immediately adjacent to Sainte-Mère-Église, a town the invasion plan had designated for capture by mid-morning at earliest. The German garrison, approximately 90 soldiers from the 91st Air Landing Division, reacted with confusion. Paratroopers weren't supposed to land in towns. The defensive doctrine called for machine gun fire into drop zones, while Americans were vulnerable in the air and disorganized on landing. But these paratroopers had landed in darkness, in built-up areas, already inside the defensive perimeter. Firefights erupted in streets, gardens, and buildings. Private Ken Russell landed near a German ammunition truck and promptly shot 2 soldiers trying to man a machine gun. Sergeant Ebisher, landing in the square, found himself in a hand-to-hand fight within 30 seconds of hitting ground. By 0200 hours, just 13 minutes after Ray's drop, American paratroopers controlled the church, the town square, and the critical crossroads. German forces retreated toward defensive positions on the town's outskirts, stunned by the speed and aggression of the assault. Captain Ray climbed back to 1,000 feet and turned toward England. His C-47 had taken 4 hits. Fuel was good, all engines running. He would learn weeks later what his reckless, low-altitude drop had accomplished. What Captain Ray couldn't have known during his desperate improvisation was that he'd accidentally discovered a tactical principle that would reshape airborne doctrine. Within hours of the drop, as dawn broke over Normandy, the operational reality became clear. The scattered drops that German commanders had counted on to neuter the airborne assault had instead created chaos that worked in favor of the Americans. Small groups of paratroopers, landing in unexpected locations, created the impression of a force much larger than 13,000 men. German commanders received reports of paratroopers in dozens of locations simultaneously, making coherent defensive response nearly impossible. But concentrated accidental drops like Ray's at Sainte-Mère-Église proved even more valuable. By 00430 hours, more than 180 American paratroopers had converged on the town, drawn by sounds of fighting and the distinctive church steeple, visible in pre-dawn light. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, organized the scattered troops into a coherent defensive perimeter. At 0600 hours, he raised an American flag over the town square, the first town in occupied France to be liberated. The low-altitude drops, while violating every safety protocol, had achieved something the carefully planned high-altitude drops could not: immediate concentration of force at a critical objective. Post-battle analysis by the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions revealed the mathematics. Of the 13,000 American paratroopers dropped during the early hours of June 6th, only 20% landed within 1 mile of designated drop zones. But in locations where pilots had dropped low, between 300 and 450 feet, parachute drift averaged less than 100 yards. At standard 600-foot altitude, drift could exceed 400 yards depending on wind conditions. Colonel William Ekman, the 505th Regimental Commander, wrote in his after-action report, "The lower drops, though initiated out of desperation and navigation error, produced tighter assault groupings than any training exercise had achieved. Men landed closer together, assembled faster, and engaged objectives with less vulnerable reorganization time." The tactical revelation went further. Paratroopers dropped at low altitude had less time exposed in the air as targets. German machine gunners trained to track parachutes descending over 30 seconds found themselves firing at men who landed in 15 seconds or less. The rapid descent also meant less drift from the intended drop point, even when that point wasn't the planned drop zone. Intelligence officers studying German after-action reports captured weeks later found consistent commentary. The speed and aggression of American paratroopers in the first hours had been unexpectedly effective. General Major Falley, who had predicted airborne operations would be operationally impractical, was killed by paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne while trying to return to his headquarters at 0400 hours. His staff later reported complete confusion about the location and strength of American forces. What emerged from the chaos was a lesson about doctrine versus reality. The carefully calculated safe parameters, 600 feet minimum altitude, 90 miles per hour drop speed, tight drop zones, had been designed to protect paratroopers. But they'd also been predicated on perfect conditions: no enemy fire, accurate navigation, clear weather. When those conditions evaporated, the doctrine became a hindrance. Pilots like Captain Ray, forced to improvise under combat conditions, had discovered that sometimes safety regulations had to be subordinated to tactical necessity. His 18 men had survived a 300-foot drop that doctrine said might kill them. More than that, they'd secured a critical objective hours ahead of schedule because they'd landed concentrated enough to immediately assault rather than spend hours reassembling. The Army Air Forces didn't officially change minimum drop altitudes after Normandy, but training exercises in preparation for Operation Market Garden in September 1944 began including low-altitude scenarios. Pilots practiced drops at 400 feet. The acceptable began to include the previously unthinkable, and the lesson extended beyond paratroopers. Throughout the war, rigid adherence to doctrine sometimes prevented adaptation to battlefield reality. The officers and pilots who succeeded were often those willing to break regulations when tactical demands required it. Captain John Ray flew, 14 more combat missions after D-Day, including Operation Market Garden and resupply missions to encircled units during the Battle of the Bulge. He never again faced a decision quite like the one over Sainte-Mère-Église. He returned to the United States in December 1945 and left military service with a Distinguished Flying Cross and Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. He rarely spoke about the Normandy drop, considering it less an act of heroism than desperate improvisation. The 18 men he dropped that night had mixed fates. Private John Steele, who hung from the church steeple for 2 hours, survived the battle and the war. He returned to Sainte-Mère-Église in 1964 for the 20th anniversary of the invasion and was greeted as a hero. A mannequin representing Steele still hangs from the church steeple today, a permanent memorial to the airborne assault. Of the original 18, 3 were killed in the initial firefight for the town. 15 survived D-Day. 11 made it through the entire war. Sainte-Mère-Église itself became a symbol of the airborne assault's success. The town was the first liberated in France, held continuously from 0600 hours on June 6th, despite multiple German counterattacks. Its capture secured the western flank of Utah Beach, allowing the 4th Infantry Division to push inland with minimal opposition from that direction. The crossroads Ray had recognized from reconnaissance photos became a supply route for the American advance toward Cherbourg. The scattered drops across Normandy, initially considered a catastrophic failure, were later reassessed. Of the 13,000 American paratroopers who jumped that night, 2,500 were casualties within the first 48 hours, a devastating 19%. But they achieved their strategic objective, disrupting German defenses during the critical hours when seaborne forces were most vulnerable. Rommel's feared armored counterattack never materialized in strength, partly because German commanders were responding to dozens of scattered paratrooper contacts across a 30-mile front. Post-war analysis calculated that the airborne assault, despite its chaotic execution, likely saved between 2,000 and 5,000 casualties among the beach landing forces by securing exits and preventing coordinated German response. The cost-benefit was brutal but favorable. The broader legacy of low-altitude drops proved mixed. Operation Market Garden in September 1944 used higher-altitude drops with better weather and achieved tighter groupings, but strategic failures doomed that operation regardless of tactical execution. By the time of the Rhine crossings in March 1945, Allied airborne doctrine had evolved to include both high-altitude mass drops and low-altitude precision insertions, depending on tactical requirements. Modern airborne operations bear little resemblance to the C-47 drops of 1944. Helicopters, which began replacing parachute assaults during Vietnam, allow pinpoint insertion without the vulnerability of parachute descent. But the fundamental principle, discovered accidentally over Normandy, remains. Concentration of force matters more than perfect adherence to safety parameters. The Sainte-Mère-Église drop is taught at the U.S. Army Airborne School at Fort Benning, though not as a recommended technique. Instead, it serves as a case study in combat decision-making under impossible conditions. The question posed to students is the same one Ray faced. When doctrine fails, when conditions collapse, when lives depend on initiative, what do you do? Sometimes the answer is to drop at 300 feet and hope the parachutes open in time. There's a tension at the heart of military operations that peacetime can never resolve. Doctrine exists to codify lessons learned, to prevent repeating past mistakes, to protect lives through tested procedures. But doctrine is written for ideal conditions. Combat rarely provides them. Captain Ray had every reason to follow regulations that night. Climbing to safe altitude, searching for the correct drop zone, following the careful parameters established by commanders who'd studied Sicily's failures, these were the responsible choices. They were also, in that specific moment over that specific French town, the wrong choices. The paratroopers who landed in Sainte-Mère-Église didn't care that they'd been dropped at 300 feet instead of 600. They cared that they landed together, close enough to immediately fight as a unit rather than spend hours vulnerable and scattered. The tactical objective was secured not because someone followed Doctrine perfectly, but because someone violated it intelligently. This isn't an argument for recklessness. Regulations exist because people die when they're ignored. But the story of that low-altitude drop teaches something more subtle. The difference between recklessness and calculated risk, between following orders and exercising judgment, between the procedure and the mission. 800 feet above Normandy, altimeter falling, enemy fire rising, Ray made a choice. He couldn't have known it would work. He only knew that doing nothing, or climbing back into killing altitude to search for a drop zone he couldn't find, guaranteed failure. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a pilot can do is play it safe. And sometimes 300 feet is exactly high enough. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? More airborne operations, fighter pilot aces, or the unsung heroes of bomber crews? Let me know in the comments below.